So, to get right to the point today, I got a little game that I'd like for you all to play. It's called, How Many Teenagers Do You Know That Are Actively Pursuing a Life with God? For most of us, that game doesn't last very long. Like a banging on a gong, the preachers say, "What's wrong with kids today?" And the song goes on and on and on. But the song being sung is partly true. We're surrounded by a generation who would rather, for the most part, smoke a joint than sit in a pew. And if I'm being honest, I'm getting really tired of placing all the blame on them. So let's just say that perhaps part of the problem, church, is you. You see, teenagers today, or people for that matter, would rather live by their own luck because they see the religious system as just way too stuck. And if you heard me say I read my Bible every day, you'd be like, what the fudge? Doesn't that mean you're quick to judge, never budge, and just a plain old schmuck? And if this is the perception that we're so full of pride, then perhaps it's time we took a look inside and reclaim the part of Jesus that we've lost. The one who partied with sinners, touched the lepers, loved the children, and who paid the highest cost. Have you ever considered just how many parties Jesus went to in the Gospels? If someone wanted to throw a party today, church, I'm not sure that they would hire us. People don't gather around Jesus anymore. They gather around Lady Gaga and Miley Cyrus. And I'm not here to bash secular music either. I'm tired of that. And plus, I like some of those songs. I'm simply here to suggest that we might also be in the wrong. It's clear that in the lives of the next generation, the church rarely plays a part. And maybe that's because some of the messages on TV and film and social media are a little bit more from the heart. The church can't be this billboard of propaganda, some list of shoulds and should nots. It's got to be a living, breathing art piece where people say, I want what they've got. When did the movement of Jesus lose its authenticity and require its members to climb to some spiritual peak? Because if only the strong survive, then how come his power is perfect when we're weak? Now, I'm not trying to start a fight, because I know some churches do this right. I'm merely here to suggest that we might just be as blind as those to whom we're trying to give sight. We as the church need to wisen up, because the next generation is rising up and they're finding their prize in the things of this world, because in their eyes, we haven't given them a better option. Running away from the church like a toxin because we're locked into a system of judgment and dismay. Hate you if you're struggling, different, or gay. Why would anyone want to stay when they're just viewed as a project on which we can project our list of rules? And the more we try and protect the children in this way, the more we reject what God is trying to project to the world through them, and that is his project of authentic love. Now, I'm not trying to be harsh. And I'm not trying to condemn either side. I'm simply suggesting that instead of forcing people onto some religious journey, why not invite them along for the ride? A lot of folks who watch the Anima series, which is a YouTube channel where that poem originally comes from, a lot of folks like to call that my angry poem. And I can maybe see where they would get that idea. I, on the other hand, actually like to call it a love letter to the next generation. My love and compassion and downright respect for young people all has its roots in a summer camp that I grew up going to and then eventually working at as a counselor. In this summer camp, it's a Christian summer camp, much like any other Christian summer camp you can imagine. And I worked there throughout all of my summers in high school and college. I worked with over 5,000 students, ages 8 to 18 in those years. And like you can imagine, any Christian summer camp, on Monday morning, 150 students show up and they get split up into different colored teams. And then they engage on a week-long journey of crazy, often dangerous outdoor games, questionable cafeteria food, and then an altar call experience on the final night where everybody just bawls their eyes out. And tonight, I want to tell you a story about this camp. And more specifically, I want to tell you the story about the first time I was hired to be the camp director for the week. And my hope is that through telling you this story, that the students and the characters in it will teach you as much as they taught me. Are you ready? Yeah. That's it. Let's do it. So, to set the scene for you, it's the summer of 2012. I'm 20 years old at the time, and I've just been hired to be the camp director for the week of high school camp. And basically what this means is that I'm going to be in charge of a team of counselors that are going to be brainstorming, planning, and executing every aspect of camp. That's devotions, that's worship, that's events, that's games, everything. I'm the head honcho. And at 20 years old, I'm thinking, I'm still in high school. How am I supposed to lead this team of counselors, of which I was one of the youngest people on the team? So needless to say, I was a bit nervous about this new position. But I was also very frustrated because about 4 weeks before camp start, I go into the camp offices and I see our camp attendance sheet. Now, as I mentioned, about the maximum number of students we usually take at this camp is around 150. And years before, when I was a camper attending camp, it seemed like we maxed out that number every single summer. Camp was always full. But for whatever reason, in the years since I'd graduated, it just seemed like students had stopped coming. And in just 3 years, we'd gone from 150 students all the way down to just 60 the year before in 2011. And here I was in the summer of 2012 as a 20-year-old brand new camp director, and I was looking at a camp attendance sheet just 4 weeks away from camp with less than 50 names on it. And that just wouldn't do for me. So I took a big first step, and I made my first goal as camp director, and I wrote it down because someone told me once you should write down your goals, and I did. And this goal is so profound, it is going to blow your minds. I wrote down, bring camp attendance back up. Now, I know it sounds a little naive and a little overly simplistic, but what you have to understand is that this was so important to me because I wanted as many students as possible to have the amazing camp experience that I had had growing up. Because what you have to understand is that camp had had a profound effect on me as a teenager. To give you an idea, camp started for me years before the summer of 2012. I was not 20 years old and I was not the camp director. I was 13 years old and I was a brand new camper. Camp started for me on the night that changed my life. Now, as I mentioned, the last night of camp is a bit of an altar call experience, and the gospel message was presented. And I remember it was the first time that I understood the gospel in a personal way. And you see, up until this point in my life, the whole idea of God and church and religion and Jesus, it had really been more of a tradition that my family did rather than a personal relationship. But I remember on that night, the night that changed my life, I remember coming to a realization in my head. And I remember thinking, I've always wanted God in my life. I just never realized that He wanted me too. And I certainly didn't realize the lengths He was willing to go in order to have me. And when I came to this realization in my 13-year-old brain, the floodgates swung wide open. Now, I know I'm a pretty big guy, but I am not a manly crier. You can ask my wife or anyone who went to our wedding. I know that some people can talk through their tears. I literally cannot form words once I start crying. The best thing I can do to control it is just do this like loud exhale thing, but then my whole body starts shaking, so it ends up looking like it's bad. And I remember on that night, I remember looking for the counselor who had presented the gospel message. His name was Ronnie. And I remember thinking, not saying because I can't talk, I remember thinking, I've got to find Ronnie. This guy changed my life. And I'm just standing in a pool of sweat and tears and hormones, and it's awful. And eventually I find Ronnie, and he's made his way over into a corner. But the minute I start to walk up to him, Ronnie goes like this. And he starts praying. So at this point, I don't know what to do because I don't want to interrupt him, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't because I can't talk. So I just kind of stand there and I'm like, but eventually, Ronnie heard my whimpering and he invited me over to sit down next to him. And over the next 5 to 10 minutes, he talked with me and he prayed with me and then he sent me on my way. And like I said, it couldn't have lasted more than a couple minutes, but that memory is etched in my mind forever. Because Ronnie was there for me on that night. And when I think about all of my years as a camper, all of my counselors, they were always there for me. It always seemed like they always had the best advice. They were always willing to pray for me. It seemed like they had all the answers. And now that I was going to be a counselor, I wanted so badly to be able to give that gift back to the students that I was going to be working with. The only problem is years later, when I found myself in Ronnie's position, sitting with students on the night that changed their lives, is that I never knew what to say. Because what do you say to a girl whose parents are going through a divorce? And how do you pray for a 16-year-old guy who's just lost his best friend to suicide? What answers do you give to the camper who's struggling with an eating disorder or who has an addiction to self-harm? What do you say? But something I've learned over a couple years of sitting with students on the night that changed their lives is that young people aren't looking for answers as much as they're looking to be heard. I hear people say all the time, they say, I pray and I pray and I pray, but God never answers my prayers. So they come to one of two conclusions. Either God doesn't hear their prayers because God is not real, or God does hear their prayers, but he's not answering because he doesn't care. And I would like to propose a third option. Maybe God does hear your prayers, but the reason that God isn't answering yet is because he knows that more than you need answers, you need to be heard. Maybe God knows that more than you need someone else telling you what you're supposed to do, you need someone who's willing to listen to what you have to say. You see, I was so concerned with being a good counselor, and I thought that meant I had to have all the answers. But over the years, I've learned something about what it means to be a good counselor. At the end of the tunnel. The best counselors are not the best lecturers or the best authority figures. They are not those who teach the best lessons, nor those who give the best advice. The best counselors are not the smartest, wisest, most engaging, or even the funniest. The best counselors are the best listeners. The best teachers are the best students. The best lecturers are the best learners, and the best leaders are those who follow most closely. The best kings are the best servants. The best preachers are the best disciples. The most loved are those who love the most, and the best death is the one that brings new life. The most successful are not those who have accomplished the most, but those who have often failed. The most intelligent are not those who have the most knowledge, but those who are willing to admit what they do not know. The wisest are not those who have lived perfect lives, but those who have made the most mistakes. And what these successful, intelligent, and wise people all have in common is that they take their failure, foolishness, and mistakes, and they learn from them. The strongest man is not the one who can lift the most weight. He is the one who is willing to admit when he is most weak. The most beautiful woman is not the one with a flawless complexion and a negative 2% body fat. She is the one who does not conceal her imperfections, for she knows that they are her Maker's mark on her that say, I made this one special. Now, I did not invent these lessons. They were started long ago by a carpenter who said, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. He said, the exalted shall be humbled, and the humbled exalted. He said, give and you shall receive. You must lose your life to save it. You must die in order to truly live. And let's not forget perhaps the simplest and definitely most disturbing of all. He said to love your enemies. So what do we do with all this? Seems like a whole lot of stuff. Well, let's start here. Listen first, then talk. Yeah, we're rich. We ain't got no money. So back to the story. It's the summer of 2012, remember? I'm 20 years old, remember? I've just been hired as the camp director for high school camp, remember? Yes. And I've just made my first goal to bring camp attendance back up. And so I started praying around this goal. And as I started praying, I can't really explain why or how, but I started to get a sense of a number. A specific number that God was placing on my heart. A number of campers that he wanted me to be praying for him to bring to camp. And I can't really explain why or how. Hearing from God's like this weird, ethereal thing. But I was so sure that this was the number that God had placed on my heart. And so I started praying that God would bring 100 campers to camp. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, John, didn't you say that the maximum number was 150? Why wouldn't you pray for the maximum? That's not very bold faith. But what you have to understand is at this point in my life, I thought this was a big, fat, faith-filled prayer to think that God could bring 100 campers to a camp. And I have to admit to you, as I started praying it, I'm not joking, I started to develop a bit of a prayer ego. I thought that God was kind of impressed with this prayer to think he could bring 100 campers to a camp. And this prayer ego of mine, it was only bolstered when I would go meet with other counselors and I would experience their doubts. And they would say things like, oh, John, we only have 47 signups. We're only a couple weeks away. You might want to be a little more realistic. Or they'll be like, John, you don't want to set yourself up for disappointment. And I literally remember thinking in my head, the Bible says, blessed are the persecuted. You're just jealous of my faith. Shun the non-believers! You see, I really thought that God was impressed with my faith. I really thought he was impressed when I thought he could bring 100 campers to a camp. But that was before I met a 9-year-old boy named Nicholas. Now, as I mentioned before, we work with students ages 8 to 18 at these camps. But we don't work with every age group in the same week. Each week, we kind of work with a different age group. Elementary school, middle school, high school. You get it. You definitely get it. And so one summer, it's the first week of camp, and we're working with 8 to 12-year-olds, or at least I am. And Nicholas is the first camper to show up on Monday morning. Now, the first camper to show up on Monday morning is almost always doomed to be an awkward experience. Because they just kind of stand there, gripping their mom's hand for dear life, just praying that someone else their size is going to show up. And they're staring at this sea of 7 to 10 overly caffeinated college students in matching t-shirts, and they're trying to get them to dance the cha-cha slide, join us, join us. It's terrible. But you see, Nicholas was anything but this awkward first camper. The minute Nicholas saw me, he walks right up to me, lets go of his mom's hand, drops his lunchbox on the ground. He walks right up to me and he goes like this. And for those of you who don't know, this is the 9-year-old version of check out my muscles. Needless to say, I liked Nicholas right away. And I liked him even more when I found out he was going to be on my team, so we'd be spending a lot of time together. Now, the last thing you have to understand about this camp is that in addition to being a Christian camp, and in addition to being a summer camp, it's also a theater camp. So it's basically all the most stereotypical types of youth camp just crammed into one. We're going to add band camp soon. It's going to be great. And basically all this means is it means that in addition to leading these colored teams, each counselor teaches a different theater skill. And I bet you can just tell by looking at me what theater skill I taught. Dance. I'm not joking. I can bust a move. So all week, I spend my time teaching Nicholas these different dances. And one day, during games time, we're playing a game called Freeze Dance, which is as easy as it sounds. When the music plays, you dance. When the music stops, you freeze and try and not get caught by me. So we're playing this game. And one of my fellow counselors, she walks up to me, she points over my shoulder, and she says, "You have a fan." And so I turn around, and this is what I see. It's Nicholas doing what I think he considered dancing, only his body is breaking like every law of anatomy and gravity. But his head is not moving. And his eyes are not blinking, and he's staring directly at me. And this goes on for like 10 seconds, and then the music stops. And everyone in the room freezes, except for Nicholas. With no regard for the rules of the game or getting knocked out, he just charged right on like a man possessed. And it took me a second to realize what was going on. But you see, Nicholas wasn't playing the game. I had been spending all week teaching Nicholas how to dance. And now he was trying to imitate what I had been teaching him so that he could impress me with his dance moves. You see, what he was doing is he was making his best effort, and he was saying, "Look, John, I'm just like you." Now, I want to be very clear. I do not look like that when I dance. I look real good. And I know it's a bit silly, but isn't this exactly what the Bible is talking about when it tells us to be imitators of God? To look at what God says in the Scriptures, to read about how Jesus lived his life, and then to make our best effort to imitate that and say, "Look, God, I'm just like you." But you see, the only difference between us and Nicholas is that Nicholas wasn't afraid of looking silly or ridiculous or being laughed at. And far too often, we allow our inhibitions or our fear of what other people will think to keep us from doing what God commands, to be an imitator of him and say, "Look, God, I'm just like you." Now, it was at this point that I started to realize that Nicholas might have a lot more to teach me than I originally thought. So, every day at lunch, I would sit with Nicholas in the hopes of gleaning some wisdom from his 9-year-old brain. And like with any 9-year-old, the question of what do you want to be when you grow up came up. And Nicholas's answer did not surprise me in the slightest. He looks at me and goes, "A bodybuilder." No surprise with the muscles thing. But then his second answer surprised me a little bit more, because every kid wants to be two things. They have to be a princess and a firefighter. Like every little kid has to be two things. One is not enough. Nicholas's second answer, he looks at me and he goes, "And a scientist." A bodybuilding scientist. This kid wants to be the Hulk. Great. And so I asked him, I said, "Well, what kind of scientist?" And without even looking up from his turkey sandwich, he goes, "I'm going to cure cancer." Really? And I have to admit, I was laughing a little bit on the inside. Because I was like, "Okay, Nicholas, let's get this straight. Hundreds of years of research from thousands of doctors, millions, probably billions of dollars in research grants. And the greatest medical minds in history are still stumped on how to find a proper cure for this terrible disease. But you, little 9-year-old, scrawny, can't dance to save his life, bodybuilding Nicholas, you're going to find the cure." And so I laughed and I was like, "Oh, you're going to find the cure, huh?" And he looks at me and he goes, "Yeah." And he goes back to eating his turkey. Now, at this point in my life, the biggest, fattest, most faith-filled prayer I could come up with was for God to bring 100 campers to a camp. A prayer that I was beginning to severely doubt was even possible. But at 9 years old, the biggest, fattest, most faith-filled prayer Nicholas could come up with was to solve the greatest medical mystery of our time. And there was not a shred of doubt in his mind that he was going to do it. And you can call it naive. But isn't this exactly what Jesus was describing when he talked about having a childlike faith? Believing in and praying for the impossible. If you tell an adult that God wants to use them in the smallest way to bring the smallest change to the smallest community, this is the response you'll get. Oh, well, I got to pray about it because my finances are a little, I want to do his will is all. But you tell a child that the creator of the universe wants to partner with them in bringing massive change to a broken world, and they will raise their hand and they will say, where do I sign up? And more of us need to have this kind of faith. A faith that is an imitator of God and says, look, God, I'm just like you. More of us need to have the childlike faith of Nicholas, believing in and praying for the impossible. More of us need to be raising our hands and signing up to change the world, because I think we can all agree that our world is in need of changing. I've quit watching the news. I'd rather watch something a bit more uplifting, like Old Yeller. Because between the race riots and the bombings and the school shootings, I'm not sure how much more I can handle viewing. And for every broken-hearted mother, trigger-happy officer, and lonely teenage mugshot that I see, I find myself saying the same thing over and over again. It's got to stop somewhere. Crying while cutting, hate crimes, and Dateline, it's got to stop somewhere. Drug busts, terrorist bombs, drinking binges, junk bonds, it's got to stop somewhere. Homophobes, hate in droves, depression, and an obsession with a fake ideal. With fitness ads and Facebook boasts that are anything but real. And the internet bully is fully convinced that she doesn't cause any pain through what she puts into cyberspace. But the tap of fingers on keys can cause far more damage than a punch to the face. We got to tell her, your words leave a trace, and they've got to stop somewhere. Classism, racism, sexism won't speak with them, sit with them, or eat with them if they don't look like me, talk like me, won't even extend the courtesy to let them walk by me without a dirty look, a flirty hook, trying to get some, but then judging her if she's already been took. And me thinking I know something about black people just because I read about them in a book. It's got to stop somewhere. Because it's only happening over a tweet. Until it's happening on your street, right at your feet, and you become one of those 140 characters. Like a sickening cycle we're doomed to repeat, retweet, but it's got to stop somewhere. Why not here? Why not with them? Why not plant seeds from which a righteous generation can stem? It's got to start somewhere. You see, we can shelter young people all we want. But once they're out in the field, the only shield they'll be wielding is the wisdom, courage, and love we either did or did not pass on. It's gotta stop somewhere. And this generation, they're the best chance we got. So, there was good news and there was bad news. The good news is that we had officially signed up 61 campers for camp, which meant that we had officially surpassed the number of campers who had signed up the previous year in 2011. The bad news was that camp was less than 2 weeks away, and we still had 39 more signups to go to reach our goal of 100. The good news is that my prayer life was better than ever. I was getting up early every morning and circling my block, just praying, God, would you bring 100 campers, 100 campers, 100 campers? The bad news was that I was beginning to severely doubt my ability to do this job as camp director. I was beginning to listen to these voices in my head that were saying, John, you're only 20 years old. John, you've never done this job before. John, look how few campers are signing up. That's because they don't think that you can really do it. Maybe you're not the right person for this job after all, John. Because after all, the year before, in the summer of 2011 at high school camp, I hadn't been the camp director. The year before, I had been nothing but what I have come to call the CD player presser. Now, as I mentioned, in the summer of 2011, the year before I became the camp director, we only had 60 campers sign up for camp. And with less campers, that means you need less counselors. But at the last minute, I was brought on as sort of an extra counselor. And I was really excited about this. But what I soon found out, it meant essentially two things. The first thing it meant is that when all the other counselors were having their meetings and they were praying and they were brainstorming and they were planning, I was kind of sitting on the outside of the circle, taking notes and not saying a word. And what it also meant is that 8 hours a day, while everyone else was up on stage rehearsing and all the other counselors were teaching and leading and touching students' lives, I was in the back of the auditorium in a tiny little booth, all by myself, pressing play, pause, and rewind on the CD player. Now, I want to be very clear. It wasn't because any of the other counselors were treating me badly. This was just my job description. They were all much older and much more qualified to be counselors, and they invited me onto their team at the last minute. They were great. These jobs were really just what was on my job description. But nevertheless, it wasn't exactly what I imagined being a counselor would be like. I thought I would be up in front, like teaching and leading and touching students' lives, but instead I was just like on the outside of the circle, taking notes, not saying a word. I was in my tiny little booth, all by myself, pressing buttons. And it would have been really easy for me that week to just kind of sit back there in my booth and complain, because the week directly before that, we'd been working with middle schoolers, and in that week, I had been one of the lead counselors. I had been up front teaching and leading and hopefully touching students' lives. It would have been really easy for me to sit back there and say, you know what, I deserve better than this. But for some reason, and certainly not by any power of my own, because I have an ego, pray for me, for some reason, I decided to make a different choice that week. And the first night of camp, I remember I got on my knees before bed, and I prayed, and I said to God, God, if all you have for me is to be a CD player presser this week, then I am going to be the best CD player presser these people have ever seen. And I don't mean to brag to you, but I was. You could not have caught that CD off guard if you tried that week. And every other little insignificant job I was given. John, can you run to Walgreens to get pens? John, we forgot something back at the dorms. John, can you run and get us Starbucks? Everything they asked me to do. I did it without pride, I did it without question, and I did it to the best of my ability. And now, was camp really that much better because I pressed play and pause at the right time? No. Was a camper going to come to know Christ because I got pens at Walgreens? I certainly hope not. So why did I work so hard as the CD player presser? Because doesn't the Bible tell us that those who can be trusted with little will also be trusted with much? Again, I hear people say all the time, they say, I want to do big things for God. I want a big mission. I want a God-sized calling for my life. The only problem is, God's just not giving me any opportunities. But then you look at their life, and they want all of this responsibility. They want these big callings, but you look at their life, and they're not even being faithful to the tiny opportunities that are right in front of them. But it is those who can be trusted with little who will also be trusted with much. And do you know why I was promoted in 1 year from CD player presser all the way to camp director. It wasn't because I'm really good at the job. It was because our camp coordinator, who's basically the administrative head over camp, she watched me that week, and she observed how I worked in the little things as a CD player presser. And after that week was over, she went to the higher-ups at camp, and she said, I think this kid deserves a chance to lead. Those who can be trusted with little will also be trusted with much. And you see, what I didn't realize was when I was sitting on the outside of that circle in those meetings, not saying a word and just taking notes, what I didn't realize was that God was actually giving me the perfect vantage point from which to watch and to learn about effective ways to lead a team of counselors. What I didn't realize was that when I was in that little booth, all by myself, pressing buttons, what I didn't realize was God was actually giving me the perfect vantage point from which to watch and to learn about effective ways to teach students. What I didn't realize was that in my tiny, insignificant job as a CD player presser, God was actually giving me the perfect vantage point from which to prepare myself to be a camp director. And maybe right now in your life, you've been given a tiny, insignificant job like a CD player presser, and I'm not going to lie to you, that job can suck. But maybe, just maybe, in it, God is giving you the perfect vantage point from which to prepare yourself for the giant calling He's about to give you. And all He's asking you to do is just be faithful in those little things for a little while so that He can trust you with so much more. Because after all, God has been doing this since the beginning of time. Life is complicated and you're overrated. Take David. David was just a shepherd with a few songs to sing. But God was preparing him to kill giants and to one day be king. Moses was the Israelites' fearless leader who took them from slavery through the desert and to the promised land. Not bad for an adopted little brother and second in command. Joshua and his troops went marching at Jericho around and around and around. Imagine how surprised they were when the walls tumbled down. Nehemiah was bearing a cup when his wall was set up. Elisha was digging in the ground when thunder started to pound. Gideon was threshing wheat before the Midianites' defeat. And what about Esther? Esther was just pretty. Somebody's beauty prize. But God was preparing her to be queen and to open up the king's eyes to her people's cries. The Samaritan woman had no idea, not even a feeling that simply by going to the well, God would meet her with healing. Catching fish was the only skill for a disciple named Peter. But where others saw a fool, God saw a leader. And Mary, all Mary wanted to do was lay flowers at a grave. A simple mission, not particularly brave. But while there, she discovered an empty cave and started a wave of good news that we'd all been saved. And then there's Jesus, the one who was raised from the dead and who saved us with the blood He shed. As a baby, not even fit for a bed. As a boy, building tables and chairs, a carpenter from birth. But as a man, building something much, much bigger, His kingdom on earth. You see, it's not the lucky or the talented or the special or just those in charge, but those who can be faithful with the little things who will be trusted with the large. As it says in Luke, Gospel number 3 out of 4, those who can be trusted with little will be trusted with more. So, the first morning of camp finally came. And sign-ups had been rolling in, and I'd been praying and praying, 100 campers. And so bright and early, I get up and I show up at camp and I walk right to our camp coordinator and I ask her, how many sign-ups do we have? And she looks at me and she says, 97. But we still could get a few walk-ins during registration. So all during registration, I'm praying and praying, 100 campers. And I'm supposed to be doing other things, but I'm praying and praying, 100 campers. And students are coming up to me being like, John, we missed you. And I'm like, I'm praying, 100 campers. And so registration finally ends, and I walk right back up to our camp coordinator, and I ask her, how many sign-ups do we have? And she looks at me and she says, 99. And what you think I'm going to tell you at this point is that the door slowly opened, and a homeless teenager walked in. And he didn't know that this was a Christian camp. But I used my paycheck that week to pay for him to come. And he came to know Jesus, and we baptized him in a tub, and now he's building churches in Uganda. But that didn't happen. We had 99 campers. And all the other counselors, they began to praise God and rejoice. And I was happy too, but I have to admit, I was really more confused. Because I had been so sure that God had said 100. I'm no expert at hearing from God, but I was so sure that 100 was the number. And in my experience, we don't worship a God who only delivers on 99% of the promise. There wasn't a couple bricks left after Jericho. It was done. I couldn't comprehend why God would have left us one short. But the reality is that 99 campers was all we would ever have that week. And don't get me wrong, we had an amazing week of camp. And these days, y'all know, camp attendance is back up. It's better than ever. They're like adding weeks of camp. They're looking at moving, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this here. They're looking at moving locations so that they can take more students every summer. It's amazing. But I would be lying to you if I didn't tell you that that number 99 always bothered me. Until a few years later, after what I thought would be my last summer as a camp counselor, I was back here in Lake in the Hills, sitting on the floor of my old room in my parents' house with this box on my lap. And in this box, I keep a lot of old notes and letters that campers have written me over the years. And in this box, I'm reading all these letters thanking me and the other counselors for always being there for them, for always being willing to pray for them, for always having the best advice, for at least seeming like we had all the answers. And as I sat there on the floor of my parents' house with this box on my lap, reading these letters from these campers, thanking me and the other counselors for all we had taught them over the years, I just sat there and I shook my head. Because anyone who has ever worked with young people knows that this is true. That those students taught me far more than I could ever teach them. You've heard just a little bit, a small smattering, if you will, of some of the lessons these campers have taught me over the years here tonight. They taught me that the best counselors are the best listeners. They taught me to be an imitator of God, to say, look, God, I'm just like you. They taught me to have a childlike faith, to believe in and pray for the impossible, and they taught me to be faithful in the little things. And as I sat there on the floor of my parents' house with this box on my lap, reflecting on these and the thousands of other lessons these students have taught me over the years, it finally hit me. And it would sound so cheesy if it wasn't so true, but in the depths of my spirit, I heard a whisper, and I can't describe it in any other way than it was the voice of God, and it said, John, you were the 100th camper. You see, God hadn't skimped on his promise whatsoever. God had delivered on the promise 100%, and he had left one slot open on purpose. And specifically, as a reminder to me, and hopefully to all of you here tonight, that no matter how old you get, and no matter how high you climb, no matter how much influence or leadership or intellect you have, he wanted to remind me, and hopefully you here tonight, that you always have so much to learn. And it is the children who are going to teach it to you. And as I sat there on the floor of my parents' house with this box on my lap, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. And I remember thinking in that moment, I have to thank these campers in some way. I know there's no way I could ever adequately do it, but I have to at least try. So I called up two of my friends, and their names are Danny and DJ. And we decided to make 2 videos and put them up on YouTube. And our only hope with these videos was just to make them, put them online, and send them to the campers, and that was it. But then those 2 videos kind of went a little crazy online. And those 2 videos turned into 100 more. And hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and tens of millions of internet views, and now a U.S. tour, and this show here tonight. And to finish our time here, I'm going to read the 2 poems that appear in those 2 videos, since they're sort of what started this whole thing off. But before I do that, I want you to know that if anything I'm about to read, or if anything I've said here tonight, or if any video we've ever made, or if anything I have ever said, done, or written has touched you, or encouraged you, or inspired you in any way, I want you to know tonight that you don't have me to thank. You have those campers to thank. They may be a godless generation, but they have taught me more about God than any preacher ever could. Now, before I read these, I want to let you know one thing. Whenever I read these 2 pieces in public, I always read them off of something, whether it's a sheet of paper or a phone or whatever. Because after you say these words so many times as I have, and you have them memorized, what can sort of happen is when you say them, they can just sort of spill out as like general encouragement. And that is the farthest thing from what these poems are meant to be. And so every time I read them in front of people, I always read it word for word and focus on the meaning of each word and the meaning of each phrase. And so my encouragement to each of you here tonight, whether this is your first time hearing these, or you've heard them a million times, or you've watched the video 4 million times, and all the views are you. My encouragement to you here tonight is for you to listen to these words as if you're hearing them for the first time. These are 2 poems that I wrote called Who You Are. One is addressed to men, and the other is addressed to women. And there's a lot of debate online exactly what these poems are about. But the only way that I can accurately describe what these poems were originally intended to be is that they are meant to be a reminder of who we are in God's eyes. So, I'm going to start with the men. Men, this is for you. You are strong. You are brave. You are capable. You are part of the Lord's most valuable creation. You have ability. You have potential. You have gifts given to you by the Lord. You have talents to share with the world. You're a writer, an athlete, an inventor, an artist, a musician, a technician, and these talents will change people. You have joy to spread. You have jokes to tell, kind words to give, and wisdom to bestow, and that joy will change people. You are full of more amazing qualities, traits, and virtues than you could ever imagine, given to you by the Lord who loves you. Who loves you no matter who you are, whether you're the big man on campus or the small guy in the back of the library. Whether you like swinging baseball bats or you like swing dancing. Whether you're the fastest or the slowest, the tallest or the shortest, the skinniest or you could lose a few pounds. Whether you're captain of the team or you're last one picked. Whether your dad could beat up his dad or you never had anyone in your life who could fill that role. Whether you're the champion of champions or you feel like the loser of losers, regardless of who you think you are, the reality is that you have a responsibility because you have a power inside of you. A power that was formed before the beginning of time in a secret place by the God of the universe. There is a man inside of you, inside each and every one of you, waiting to burst forth and change the world. And this is a man who loves, encourages, comforts, shares, teaches, laughs, cries, and who builds up those around him. And that man is where your strength lies. That man is where your potential lies. And that man is where your gifts, talents, courage, ability, and joy lies. And your responsibility as a son of God is to set that man free. And when he is set free, he will bring change to our broken world. You will bring change to our broken world. And any voices in your head that are trying to tell you differently are from the enemy. And the next time you hear them, this is what you say. You say, nuh-uh. Not me, Satan. I am a son of the living God, treasured, entrusted, and loved above all things by the Creator of all things, for the glory of Him who is greater than all things. I am awesome, and don't you forget it. This is who you are. Now for the women. Women, this is for you. You are beautiful. You are smart. You are funny. You are kind. You are unique. You are worthy of love and affection. You are never too much, and you are always enough. You are precious. You are a diamond, a rose, a pearl, the most stunning of all God's creations. You are worth more than you could ever imagine. Worth more than the numbers on the scale, or the hair product you use, or the shoes you wear. More than how many girls wish they were you, or how many guys wish they had you. More than the price tags on your clothes, or the percentage at the top of your math test, or even the number of followers you have on Twitter. Your worth surpasses all earthly things, because in the eyes of the Lord God, you are loved, and you are worth dying for. Regardless of who you think you are. Whether you model in a magazine, or you model pottery with grandma. Whether you're on the hot list or the not list. Whether you're a head cheerleader or a high school dropout, whether you're Miss Popular or you never had anyone that you could call a friend, whether you love yourself and love your life or you can't stand to look in the mirror and you feel as if everything in your life is falling apart, whether you feel like such a winner or you feel like the world's biggest failure, regardless of who you think you are, the reality is that you deserve someone who would give up their life for you, because you too are powerful and strong and capable. Read about the women in the Bible. Esther, Ruth, Martha, Mary. These women changed the world forever. And inside of you, each and every one of you is a woman with that same power and that same strength and that same world-changing capability. And your responsibility is to find that woman and to set that woman free. This is who you are. And any voices in your head that try and tell you differently are from the enemy. And the next time you hear them, this is what you say. You say, nuh-uh. Not me, Satan. I am a daughter of the living God, cherished, loved, and adored above all things by the Creator of all things, for the glory of Him who is greater than all things. I am awesome. And please, don't you forget it. Thank you for coming tonight.